Welcome to our deep dive into the kind of surprising story of Bangladesh's development. We've got some fascinating research and excerpts from El-Kabir's book,
Renegotiating Patriarchy.
Renegotiating Patriarchy, to explore. It's a book that economists are really praising for its insightful look at a nation that's defied a lot of expectations.
Yeah, it's a story that, as one economist put it, has puzzled many for a long time. You see Bangladesh, a nation facing immense challenges like poverty, dense population, and deeply entrenched patriarchal norms,
Right.
managed to achieve significant progress in human development. It's
Yeah.
quite the paradox.
Yeah, okay, so we're talking about defying those prophets of doom who saw the nation as stuck in...
A below poverty equilibrium trap.
Can you explain what that means for our listener?
Certainly, imagine a country so poor that it can't invest in things that would help it grow, like
Right.
education or infrastructure, like being stuck in quicksand. The harder you struggle, the deeper you sink. That's the poverty trap. Many experts thought Bangladesh was destined for this fate.
But they were wrong. And renegotiating patriarchy doesn't just give us the broad strokes.
Right.
It delves into the lives of ordinary people, especially women, showing how their choices and actions played a part in this transformation.
Yes. It focuses on the view from below, revealing how women, despite limited resources and restrictive norms, actively navigated patriarchal structures and made strategic choices within the constraints they faced.
Okay.
It's like they were constantly bargaining with patriarchy.
That's such a powerful image. So to really appreciate how remarkable Bangladesh's progress is, let's start by painting a picture of the challenges they faced at independence in 1971.
Imagine a nation emerging from a war, inheriting extreme poverty. It was the second poorest country in the world, with one of the highest female mortality rates globally.
Wow.
Some anthropologists even referred to women as the endangered sex, due to the deeply rooted patriarchal norms that disadvantaged them from birth.
Wow, endangered sex is such a stark term. It really highlights the severity of the situation. But to understand how all this unfolded, we need to delve into the historical and geographical factors that shaped Bangladesh, right?
Absolutely. Bangladesh's location in the Bengal Delta region is key.
Okay.
This land of rivers and fertile soil prone to floods and cyclones has shaped its economic and social development in ways that don't quite fit the typical South Asian model.
Right.
This idea of multiple frontiers comes into play here.
Multiple frontiers. Can you elaborate on that for our listener?
Think of it this way. Bangladesh's delta landscape, with its shifting rivers and changing coastlines, created multiple zones of interaction and settlement throughout history.
Yeah.
This led to a unique blending of cultures and influences, unlike regions with more fixed boundaries.
Okay.
This history of diverse interactions is key to understanding Bangladesh's development trajectory.
Interesting. So geographically, they were already set apart from the beginning,
Okay.
and then you have the influence of various rulers and religions over centuries, right?
Yes. The rise of Islam, for example, happened gradually and blended with existing Hindu-Buddhist beliefs. This wasn't a sudden conversion, but a slow, organic process of cultural exchange resulting in a syncretic form of Islam unique to Bangladesh.
By syncretic, you mean?
It means a blending of different religious traditions and practices. In Bangladesh, you see elements of Sufism, Hinduism, and folk traditions woven into the fabric of Islam. It's a more fluid and adaptable form of the religion. We see this fluidity even in something as simple as names.
Names. What do you mean?
Well, there's this phenomenon in the early 20th century where Bengali Muslims began adopting higher status Islamic names, even though many had retained Hindu caste names from their ancestors. It illustrates the complex layering of identities and the blurring of religious boundaries.
It's fascinating how these historical nuances shape the nation's identity, but we can't forget about British colonialism and the impact it had on the region.
Of course, British rule brought its own set of challenges, from economic exploitation to the devastating 1943-44 Bengal famine, which tragically killed millions. This exposed the flaws in colonial policies and fueled a growing sense of nationalism.
It's hard to overstate the impact of that famine. It really eroded any remaining legitimacy the British Raj had in the region, setting the stage for Bangladesh's eventual independence in 1971.
But independence also meant inheriting a legacy of poverty and vulnerability.
Right.
And this is where things get really interesting. Amidst all these historical and structural constraints, we need to recognize the agency of women.
And this is where renegotiating patriarchy really shines. right?
Yeah.
It shifts our focus to the individuals, specifically women, and how they navigated this complex landscape.
Exactly. It challenges the notion that they were simply passive victims of circumstance. It reveals their resilience, their strategic decision-making, and ultimately their vital role in driving Bangladesh's progress.
It's like they were playing a hand they were dealt, but playing it incredibly well.
Precisely. They were making choices big and small that would have a ripple effect on their families, communities, and ultimately the nation's development.
So how did this play out in practice? What were some of the key factors that allowed Bangladesh to defy those dire predictions?
One of the most significant changes was the decline in fertility rates.
Okay.
Bangladesh achieved one of the fastest fertility declines in history, defying the assumption that modernization is a prerequisite for such change.
That's a pretty big deal, especially considering how skeptical people were about family planning efforts back
Oh,
then.
absolutely. You see, early on, the dominant narrative was one of fatalism.
Right.
Children were seen as a gift from God, and birth control was seen as interfering with divine will. There were even reports in the 1970s about women wanting 7, 8, even 9 children.
But something shifted. What happened?
Well, as poverty-intensified families, particularly women, realized that having fewer children meant better opportunities to provide for them, they were making a calculated choice. It was a poverty-led decline, as some researchers call it.
So it wasn't just about changing attitudes, but about the practical realities of raising a family in poverty. That makes a lot of sense.
And this shift was facilitated by the government and NGOs working together. They adopted culturally sensitive strategies for disseminating family planning information and services. Imagine them going door to door using radio programs and even recruiting local women as family planning educators, making the information more accessible and relevant.
So they were constantly adapting their approach based on what worked best in different communities.
Exactly. They were flexible and responsive to the needs and concerns of the people they were trying to reach. And that flexibility was key to overcoming the initial resistance and skepticism towards family planning.
That's a fascinating insight into how social change can happen, not just through policy, but through understanding and adapting to local context.
And that's just one piece of the puzzle. Another crucial factor was the remarkable expansion of education, particularly for girls.
From what I understand, education was seen as a way to empower daughters, to improve their life chances, and break the cycle of poverty. It was a powerful motivator for parents.
You're absolutely right. Even parents with limited resources were increasingly willing to make sacrifices to educate their daughters. And this was supported by government and NGO initiatives who made education more accessible through stipends, scholarships, and establishing schools in remote areas.
Renegotiating Patriarchy shares a powerful anecdote about a father who said, "I am sure that when she passes the IA intermediate exam, nobody will brand her as a rickshaw driver's daughter."
It really highlights the transformative aspirations attached to education. He saw it as a way for his daughter to transcend her social standing and secure a better future.
And this wasn't just wishful thinking. As more women became educated, new opportunities opened up for them in various sectors.
And one of the most significant was the rise of the garment industry, which we'll delve into after a quick break.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more on the remarkable story of Bangladesh's development. Welcome back to our deep dive into Bangladesh's development story. Right before the break, we were talking about how education opened up new opportunities for women, particularly in the booming garment industry.
Yes, the rise of the garment industry was a game changer for Bangladesh and for women in particular. It became a major source of employment for them, providing a path to financial independence and a chance to challenge traditional gender norms.
But wasn't there some pushback against this? I mean, wasn't there concern about women entering the workforce in such large numbers?
Oh, absolutely. There was societal disapproval. Families had to adjust, and women themselves had to overcome anxieties about working outside the home. It definitely wasn't a smooth or easy transition.
Renegotiating Patriarchy touches on how the government and employers didn't even anticipate women's participation in this industry initially.
It's true. One early government brochure actually boasted about Bangladeshi labor to foreign investors, describing them as very intelligent and the least demanding,
Wow.
without mentioning gender at all. It wasn't until later that they recognized the potential of female labor in this sector.
But despite this initial lack of planning, women flocked to the garment factories. What drew them there?
Well, they were drawn by the promise of regular wages and a chance to escape the confines of their homes.
Ugh.
It was a way to contribute to their family's well-being, and for some, even a means to escape unhappy or abusive marriages.
The book quotes one woman who said, "In our society, women are left with nothing when the marriage does not work. I have taken this job so that I can take care of myself and not depend on anybody."
That quote really captures the sense of empowerment and self-reliance that garment work provided. It allowed them to stand on their own 2 feet.
It's inspiring, really. It shows how economic opportunity can be a powerful tool for social change. But this wasn't just about individual empowerment. Didn't these shifts in women's lives have a ripple effect on families and communities?
Absolutely. As women contributed more to the household income, their decision-making power within families grew. We see this reflected in changing dowry practices, where women's education and employment became bargaining chips, sometimes even reducing the amount of dowry demanded by the groom's family.
So the patriarchal bargain, that unspoken agreement about men holding power in exchange for providing and protecting women, was being renegotiated.
Exactly. As women gained economic power, they were able to challenge those traditional norms and redefine their roles within the family and society.
And this shift was happening alongside a resurgence of Islamic piety in Bangladesh, which is interesting because you might expect that to have the opposite effect.
That's a crucial point, and it speaks to the complexity of this story. While Bangladesh had a secular foundation, the post-independence period saw a rise in Islamic influence, particularly under military regimes.
So how did this growing Islamic influence intersect with the progress we've been discussing, especially in terms of women's agency? Was there a clash?
It's not that simple. Remember that syncretic Islam we talked about earlier?
Uh,
That more fluid, adaptable form of the religion? It continued to play a significant role shaping how people interpreted and practiced their faith.
so it wasn't a case of Islam versus women's progress.
No, not at all. The resurgence of Islam wasn't a monolithic force. You had different interpretations and different agendas at play. Some advocated for stricter adherence to Islamic law, promoting traditional gender roles, and pushing back against what they perceived as Western influences.
That reminds me of the attacks on NGOs we touched upon earlier. Some saw those organizations as promoting a secular agenda.
Yes, those attacks were a stark reminder of the tensions simmering beneath the surface. But it's crucial to note that not all Muslims supported those attacks, and even within the religious community, there were diverse viewpoints.
So it's like there was this tug of war between different visions of Islam, each trying to shape the nation's identity and social norms. And amidst all of this, you had women making their own choices.
Precisely. Take the trend of veiling, for example. It became increasingly common in Bangladesh, but the motivations behind it were quite varied.
Renegotiating Patriarchy delves into how veiling couldn't be attributed to a single universal meaning.
Yes, for some women, it was a deeply personal expression of faith, a way to fulfill their religious obligations and strive for piety. They found empowerment in adopting stricter forms of veiling like the burqa or the abaya with a face covering.
But for others, it seemed more about social pressure, or even a form of protection in a society where women's safety in public spaces wasn't always guaranteed.
Exactly. Some, particularly women from more affluent families, adopted full veiling as a marker of respectability and status, while others saw it as a way to conform to community expectations or avoid unwanted attention. It's a great example of how we can't always make assumptions about the meaning behind cultural practices. We need to understand the context.
This reminds me of something else the book highlighted, the contrast between women from different social classes and how they navigated their faith and their aspirations.
Right. Many poorer women, while devout, also relied on NGOs for essential services and economic opportunities. They were less likely to embrace interpretations of Islam that would restrict their mobility or limit their options.
It seems like they were pragmatically balancing their faith with their need for survival and progress.
Exactly. They were finding ways to reconcile their beliefs with their desire for a better life. One woman quoted in the book simply said, "My religion is my business." It's a powerful statement about claiming agency within the framework of one's faith.
I love that quote. It speaks to the resilience and adaptability of these women.
And this agency extended beyond just economic matters. It also manifested in the shifting dynamics between parents and children.
Oh, that's right. The book talks about the phenomenon of unruly sons, young men who were becoming more independent, challenging parental authority, and sometimes making choices that went against tradition. What was driving this change?
He was partly driven by economic changes. As opportunities expanded beyond the village, young men were more likely to migrate for work or education, exposing them to new ideas and ways of life. They were returning with different expectations and a desire for more autonomy.
So it's like they were breaking free from the traditional constraints of rural patriarchy.
Yes, and this had a profound impact on family structures. Sons were no longer as reliable as sources of support for their aging parents. They weren't always there to fulfill those traditional filial duties.
And this led to a reevaluation of the traditional patriarchal bargain.
Exactly. Daughters who were increasingly educated and economically independent stepped into the gap, taking on more responsibility for their parents' well-being. Parents recognizing this started investing more in their daughters. They provided them with better education, healthcare, and even delayed their marriages.
So in a sense, the changing economic landscape, coupled with the rise of women's agency, was reshaping the family structure from within.
Precisely. It was a pragmatic adaptation to changing realities. Parents were, in a sense, hedging their bets, ensuring they had support in their old age, whether from sons or daughters.
So it wasn't just altruism driving this change, but a recognition that the old model of relying solely on sons was no longer viable. The patriarchal bargain was being rewritten.
Exactly. And this rewriting was happening at multiple levels: individual choices, family dynamics, community norms, and even national policies. It was a complex and messy process with no single driving force.
And this process played out differently in various regions of Bangladesh, right? I mean, local customs, economic conditions, and the influence of various institutions all played a role.
You're absolutely right. The book highlights this by revisiting the village of Amarpur, where Naila Kabir had conducted her early research in the 1970s.
It's like a case study within a case study, allowing us to track how gender roles and family dynamics evolved over several decades. What did they find?
They found both continuity and change. Some families still clung to traditional son preference, but there was a clear shift towards valuing daughters more, investing in their education, and recognizing their potential contributions to the family's well-being.
It seems like Bangladesh was rewriting its own story in a way that defied the assumptions of those who had predicted its doom. It's a story about resilience, adaptation, and the power of individual agency to drive social change.
It is. And as we wrap up our deep dive, I think it's important to consider the broader implications of Bangladesh's experience. What lessons can we learn? What can it teach us about the possibilities for positive change in other parts of the world?
Those are great questions, and ones we'll explore in our next episode. So until then, keep exploring. Welcome back to our deep dive into Bangladesh's development. We've seen how they defied the odds, but what's really interesting is to look at what happens elsewhere.
Exactly. Renegotiating Patriarchy actually compares Bangladesh's trajectory with India's, which is fascinating because on the surface they share so many similarities,
Right.
but the outcomes were vastly different.
You're talking about what the book calls the reverse paradox in India, right?
Yes.
Where, despite economic growth, son preference actually intensified. That led to some really troubling trends, like a rise in sex-selective abortions.
It's a stark contrast. Both countries grapple with poverty and patriarchal norms. But why did son preference weaken in Bangladesh while it became even more entrenched in India?
Yeah, it really makes you question those assumptions about how development should work. There's clearly more to the story than just economic growth.
One key difference the book argues lies in how rigid the patriarchal bargain is in different regions.
Okay.
In parts of North India, particularly among upper castes, there's this deeply entrenched system where sons are essential for everything.
Right.
Carrying on the family lineage, inheriting land, performing religious rituals, and providing for parents in their old age.
So daughters are seen as a liability in this system because they're expected to marry out and essentially become part of another family.
Precisely. It creates a situation where investing in daughters is perceived as a loss for the family, while sons are the only path to security and status. This system is so deeply embedded in social norms, religious beliefs, and even legal frameworks that it's incredibly difficult to challenge.
And ironically, as economic modernization took hold and the pressure to provide dowries for daughters increased, it actually made things worse, pushing families towards more drastic measures like sex-selective abortion.
Exactly. It became a means of survival within a system that placed such a high premium on sons. Bangladesh, however, had a more flexible patriarchal bargain.
Okay.
It wasn't as rigidly tied to land ownership or lineage. Daughters weren't automatically seen as a loss, and there was more room for adaptation and change.
So when economic opportunities for women expanded, daughters actually became valuable assets. They could contribute financially, support their families, and even challenge those traditional gender roles.
Precisely. And this brings us to a broader point about structure and agency. Social change isn't just about top-down policies or broad economic forces.
Right.
It's also about how individuals within their own context navigate and sometimes even subvert existing structures.
So it's about recognizing that people have the power to make choices and shape their own destinies, even within systems that seem to limit their options.
Renegotiating Patriarchy is so powerful because it goes beyond the statistics and shows us the human side of these transformations.
Yeah.
It highlights the stories of resilience, adaptation, and the quiet revolutions that are happening within families and communities.
It's a reminder that even in the face of incredible challenges, change is always possible.
Bangladesh's story really underscores that development isn't a one-size-fits-all formula. It's a dynamic process shaped by individual choices, evolving social norms, and this fascinating interplay between structure and agency.
It's given me so much to think about as we wrap up. What's one key takeaway you hope our listener will walk away with?
I think the most important lesson is to recognize the power of those individual stories, those acts of courage and resilience that can ultimately drive social change.
I love that. It's about looking beyond the data and seeing the human faces behind the numbers.
Exactly. And as we face the complex challenges of our own time, we should remember that progress is often driven by those quiet revolutions, those individual choices that collectively create a ripple effect of change.
So as you continue your own deep dive into whatever topic fascinates you next, keep those questions in mind. Where do we see individuals pushing back against the status quo?
Yes.
Where are those seeds of change being planted?
Because those are the stories that inspire us, challenge our assumptions, and remind us that a better future is always possible.
And on that note, happy exploring.